Most people believe they are losing their patience because someone else is behaving irrationally, but the real disturbance begins long before the irritation appears. You call them stupid, careless, unreasonable, impossible to talk to. Yet something in you reacts far louder than the situation should ever require. Your heart rate changes, your thoughts sharpen into silent arguments, your face tightens while you pretend to remain calm and reasonable. You tell yourself you are only reacting to their behavior, but the intensity of your reaction suggests something much older is being touched. You replay their words hours later, not because they mattered, but because they pierced a place you did not know was still sensitive. You imagine what you should have said, what you will say next time, how you will finally put them in their place without losing composure. And strangely, this mental rehearsal feels important, almost necessary, as if winning an invisible argument could restore something missing inside you. But they go home unaffected, unaware, unbothered, while you carry the weight of a conversation they have already forgotten. So the question slowly forms, quietly uncomfortable. Why does their stupidity seem to control your internal state more than your own intelligence does? But to understand this, we need to look at what you believe is happening when you face someone you think is foolish. When you deal with someone you consider stupid, you assume the problem is their lack of logic, their refusal to understand what is obvious to you. You believe that if they could only think more clearly, listen more carefully, or process information properly, the tension would disappear immediately. You see yourself as the reasonable one, the patient one, the one trying to make sense in a situation polluted by confusion. This belief feels comforting because it places you in the position of mental superiority while explaining your frustration as justified. You tell yourself that your anger is not emotional, but rational, because anyone in your position would feel the same irritation. You feel trapped in conversations where simple ideas must be repeated, where obvious facts must be defended, where clarity feels wasted. And so you begin to believe that your exhaustion comes from constantly carrying the burden of thinking for both of you. You imagine that if you could just make them understand, the tension would dissolve and peace would return instantly. You rehearse better explanations in your head, believing that the next time you will present your thoughts in a way they cannot possibly misunderstand. This gives you a sense of control, as though the solution lies in communication, patience, and better expression of your intelligence. You believe the problem is external, located entirely in their inability to process reality as efficiently as you do. This belief protects you from examining your own reaction, because it frames you as the victim of someone else's mental limitations. It also allows you to feel morally right in your irritation, because you are simply reacting to unnecessary difficulty placed in your path. You feel like a teacher forced to deal with a student who refuses to learn, a driver stuck behind someone who refuses to move. And this analogy strengthens your certainty that the problem is not you, but the obstacle presented by their behavior. You tell yourself that your frustration is evidence of your intelligence, because only someone who understands clearly can be bothered by confusion. This narrative becomes so convincing that you never question why some people's stupidity affects you deeply, while others do not disturb you at all. You never stop to notice that the intensity of your reaction varies depending on who the person is and what they represent. Instead, you stay focused on the surface explanation, that you are simply dealing with someone who lacks basic reasoning. But this is where most people misunderstand what's really happening. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. What begins to surface is an uncomfortable observation that your reaction is rarely about intelligence, but about something far more personal and fragile. You notice that strangers behaving foolishly rarely disturb you as deeply as people whose opinions you secretly care about. This suggests the irritation is not triggered by stupidity itself, but by the meaning you attach to who is being stupid. When a random person acts irrationally, you dismiss it quickly, but when someone close does, it feels like a personal offense. You start to sense that the problem is not their thinking, but what their thinking implies about you and your position. It feels as though their refusal to understand you threatens your sense of being seen, respected, or acknowledged as competent. Suddenly the frustration looks less like intellectual disagreement and more like a reaction to invisible disrespect. You begin to realize that what hurts is not the lack of logic, but the feeling of being mentally ignored. This creates a strange tension where you are not trying to fix their thinking, but trying to restore your sense of importance. You argue harder not to clarify the truth, but to prove that you should be taken seriously. And without noticing, the conversation becomes less about facts and more about your need to be recognized. Their stupidity now feels like a mirror reflecting something you are uncomfortable seeing about your own insecurities. You feel this quietly, but you do not want to admit it, because it challenges the story that you are purely rational. So you return to the safer belief that they are simply difficult, stubborn, and incapable of understanding, but the discomfort remains. Because somewhere inside you know the irritation is not as innocent as it first appeared. And this is where things begin to turn inward in a way most people try to avoid. Long before you learn to argue with people, your brain learned to react strongly when it felt unseen or dismissed. As a child, being misunderstood often meant being ignored, and being ignored felt dangerously close to being unimportant. Your nervous system quietly linked misunderstanding with social threat, because belonging has always been a survival requirement. So when someone fails to understand you today, your brain does not treat it as a minor disagreement, but as a familiar warning signal. This reaction is fast, automatic, and emotional. Long before your rational mind begins forming arguments or explanations, you feel the tightening in your chest, the urgency to correct them, the pressure to restore clarity immediately. What you interpret as irritation is actually an old survival mechanism trying to prevent you from feeling socially invisible. Your brain remembers what it felt like when your words were dismissed, and it tries to prevent that feeling from happening again. So it pushes you to argue, to explain, to insist, because doing nothing feels like allowing yourself to disappear. You are not trying to win a debate. You are trying to secure your place in the social environment. For example, you explain something simple to a colleague, they misunderstand it repeatedly, and you feel disproportionately tense. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. The tension is not about the information, but about the silent fear that your clarity is not being valued. Your brain reacts as though your social worth is being quietly questioned by their inability to follow your reasoning. This is why the irritation feels intense, personal, and difficult to let go even after the interaction ends, because the moment does not end when the conversation ends. It lingers as a feeling of having been subtly invalidated. You replay it later, trying to mentally repair the experience by imagining better responses that restore your sense of presence. All of this happens automatically, without you realizing that your reaction is conditioned by years of social learning. But to understand what keeps this cycle alive, we need to look at what you secretly gain from this reaction. There is a quiet emotional reward hidden inside your frustration that you rarely acknowledge because it conflicts with how you see yourself. Feeling irritated by someone's stupidity allows you to feel mentally superior without having to say it out loud. This superiority feels subtle, private, and strangely comforting, especially in moments where you otherwise feel uncertain or overlooked. Their confusion becomes proof that you are clearer, sharper, more aware, and this restores a fragile sense of internal balance. You begin to notice that your irritation also gives you a role to play, the reasonable one. Surrounded by irrationality, this role feels familiar, almost scripted, and you slip into it effortlessly without noticing how often it repeats. You tell yourself you are only reacting, but you are also unconsciously enjoying the contrast it creates between you and them. The frustration becomes a stage where you get to feel competent, intelligent, and justified in your perspective. Without this contrast, you would have to sit quietly with your own doubts about how smart or capable you really are. So the irritation is not only unpleasant, it is also stabilizing in a way that feels necessary to your self-image. You feel alive in these moments, mentally alert, engaged, almost energized by the need to correct or explain. This is why you replay the interaction later, because the emotional charge keeps your sense of identity active. Letting it go would mean losing the small psychological boost that comes from feeling intellectually validated. And this is why the situation lingers in your mind longer than it logically should. But this is where the pattern becomes deeply uncomfortable to examine. Over time, reacting this way stops feeling like a reaction and starts feeling like part of who you are. You begin to describe yourself as someone who has little patience for stupidity, as if this trait defines your personality. You say it casually, even proudly, without realizing you are reinforcing a pattern that keeps you emotionally reactive. This identity gives you a sense of consistency because you always know how you will feel in these situations. You expect to be irritated, and because you expect it, your brain prepares for it before the situation even unfolds. You enter conversations already braced for misunderstanding, which makes misunderstanding feel inevitable and familiar. For example, you meet someone new. They ask simple questions, and you instantly feel the familiar tightening inside. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. This reaction happens before they have actually done anything wrong, because the identity has already predicted the outcome. Logic does not dissolve this pattern, because it is no longer about the situation, but about maintaining a familiar sense of self. If you stopped reacting this way, you might feel strangely disoriented, unsure of who you are without this irritation. You might have to confront the uncomfortable possibility that your patience is not as strong as you believed. So you continue the pattern not because it makes you feel good, but because it makes you feel consistent. And consistency, even when uncomfortable, often feels safer than change. But to see beyond this identity, we need to shift how you see the entire problem. What if the real disturbance is not their stupidity, but your expectation that other minds should move at the same speed as yours? You assume that clarity is universal, that logic is obvious, that understanding should happen quickly when information is presented correctly. This assumption feels reasonable, but it quietly ignores how differently human minds are wired by experience, emotion, and perception. You begin to see that what you call stupidity may simply be a different mental map trying to navigate the same terrain. Their confusion is not an attack on your intelligence, but evidence that their internal world is structured differently from yours. When you remove the expectation of mental similarity, the irritation begins to look less justified and more revealing. You notice that you were never upset about their thinking, but about the gap between their thinking and your expectation. This gap feels uncomfortable, because it reminds you that control over other minds is an illusion you have been protecting. You cannot force alignment. You cannot accelerate comprehension. You cannot make someone see what they are not ready to see, and strangely, this realization feels both unsettling and relieving at the same time. You start to sense that the tension came from trying to make reality match an internal rule you never questioned. Without this rule, their behavior loses its personal sting and becomes something neutral, almost observational. You watch the interaction instead of becoming entangled inside it. Noticing differences without interpreting them as threats, this shift does not solve anything. But it changes the emotional weight you were carrying without realizing it. But this is where a quieter change begins to take place inside you. You begin to notice your reactions before they fully form, like watching a wave rise before it crashes. The familiar irritation still appears, but it feels slightly more distant, as though you are observing it rather than becoming it. You catch yourself preparing to argue internally, then pause, curious about why the impulse appeared so quickly. This curiosity replaces some of the urgency, creating a small space between the trigger and your response. In this space, you start to feel less threatened by misunderstanding and more interested in how your mind interprets it. You notice that not every foolish comment needs a mental response, not every misunderstanding requires internal correction. Some moments pass without leaving the heavy residue they once did. And this feels quietly unfamiliar. You find yourself less invested in proving clarity and more aware of how easily confusion arises between people. The interaction becomes less about winning and more about witnessing the strange differences between human perspectives. You feel lighter not because others changed, but because your internal pressure to fix them has softened. This softness is subtle, almost invisible, but it alters the emotional tone of your experiences in small ways. And this is where the experience begins to feel different from anything you have felt before. At some point, you realize the people you called stupid were never the true focus of this experience. They were mirrors reflecting how deeply you needed to feel understood, respected, and mentally acknowledged by others. Their confusion exposed a sensitivity you did not know you carried, quietly shaping your reactions for years. You start to see that the irritation was never about them failing to think clearly, but about you fearing invisibility. This fear had been disguised as intelligence, patience, and rationality, hiding comfortably behind logical explanations. When you look back, you notice how often you were fighting not for truth, but for recognition. You see how exhausting it was to carry conversations in your head long after they had ended in reality. And you begin to feel a strange compassion for the version of yourself that needed to argue so intensely. That version was trying to protect something fragile without knowing a different way to do it. Now, the same situations appear quieter, less charged, almost neutral in a way that surprises you. You notice that people remain the same, but your internal experience of them feels fundamentally different. And this is where an unexpected calm begins to replace the tension you once thought was unavoidable. But before this settles completely, there is one final realization waiting quietly underneath. You understand now that dealing with people you once called stupid was never a test of patience, but a doorway into self-awareness. Each irritation was pointing toward something unresolved inside you, something that had nothing to do with their thinking. The moments that once drained you now feel like subtle reminders of how easily the mind creates personal meaning. You no longer feel the same urgency to correct, explain, or mentally win conversations that never truly mattered. Instead, you notice a quiet curiosity about how differently people see the world without needing to fix that difference. This curiosity feels lighter than frustration, calmer than superiority, and more honest than the stories you once told yourself. You begin to wonder how many other reactions in your life are shaped by invisible expectations you have never questioned. And as this question lingers, you realize the process of noticing has only just begun.